What follows is an illuminating conversation with Atlanta entrepreneur Chris Appleton. He's the founder and CEO of Sewn Arts. Reading from his website here, Sewn Arts is a nonprofit organization focused on building demand and capacity amongst hospitals, public health agencies, and corrections facilities to integrate arts-based solutions into their mission and business strategy. His work has been featured in the New York Times, CNN, ABC, CBS, NPR, Fast Company, and more. He's received numerous awards, including the Americans for the Arts National Emerging Leader Award, the Emory Council for Creativity and the Arts Community Impact Award, New Leaders Council Alumni Award, guest at the 2011 White House Youth Summit, doing this without my glasses, that's why I'm stumbling here, was a member of the 2019 class of Leadership Atlanta, received honors such as the Atlanta Business Chronicle's 40 Under 40, Georgia Trends 100 Notable Georgians, Outstanding Atlanta Class of 2014, and the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers. Let me catch my breath. As mentioned before, Chris is a friend from middle school and the first part of high school. So this conversation is organic of a catching up, as you're gonna find on this podcast for sure, and perhaps any other. We hadn't really spent any time together since about 1998. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Sewn Arts founder and CEO, proud Atlantan, Chris Appleton.
Chris, it's good to see you, buddy.
Great to see
It's
you.
been a long time. This feels weird now that we're recording, but I've been wanting to tell you, it's been really cool to see you around, and I've really wanted to know what you've been up to, because we kind of, I guess in middle school, we hung out 8th, 9th grade. You went to a different school. I went to a different school. Kind of lost touch a little bit.
25 years.
So you've got a lot under your belt so far in your career, and I want to talk to you about that. I wanted to catch up with you about it anyway, but then I started to find out more and thought this is worth sharing with a lot more people, your journey. Why don't you just start with telling me what you have going on right now?
Sure. So in addition to raising a couple of young children with my wife in Atlanta, we've got a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old, which makes for interesting times pretty much every day. I lead a small organization that works at the intersection of the arts and health, called Sewn, S-E-W-N, Sewn Arts. And we help integrate evidence-based arts and culture solutions into the health and wellness industry. It's a lot of lingo for saying we're trying to improve people's mental health and give them access to arts and culture experiences.
All right. I have tons of questions on that regard. So as much as you want to expand when this torn, oh, that's a train. Sorry, everybody, that's a train.
We're in Atlanta.
Yeah, we are at Terminus, right?
Terminus.
The end of the railroad. So what are some of the types of art that you have kind of brought light to through your company?
Yeah, we work with artists that are working in visual art, in theater, music, kind of all of the above. I to share a little bit about my own kind of relationship to arts and culture. When as a teenager, I despite doing well in school and being a successful athlete and having lots of friends and a good home life, I struggled a great deal with substance abuse and ended up entering into recovery and getting sober at 19 years old after a couple of attempts at rehab and all that comes along with that. And writing, creative writing, was just a huge outlet for me. I ended up studying English in college, and it was a really important way for me to cope with some of the challenges of being a young person that didn't have the social lubricant of alcohol or drugs to connect with other people, to kind of cope with what so many young people are going through, and found a really fantastic community in the arts community. And in fact, ended up starting a business called Wonder Root with a couple of buddies. One that we went to school with at Holy Innocents back in middle school, Alex West. He was a year younger. Alex is still a dear friend of mine, but we started this organization that was providing access to arts and culture production facilities. We had a recording studio and a dark room, pottery studio, digital media lab. We did these community programs and grew that over 15 years to a very successful organization, nationally recognized organization. And then I ended up leaving about 3 years ago, a little less than 3 years ago. Took some time to learn some important lessons and think about my leadership journey. Support my wife during the birth of our first child, and ended up starting this organization, Sewn. And it's been,
and that's SEWN.
That's right. Yeah. And this space that we're trying to fill, where we really see that there's opportunity, and this is kind of getting into the weeds on the industry, but for the last 15 years or so in the arts and culture field, there's been a broad movement and a successful movement to incorporate arts and culture into other parts of civic life, whether that's into economic development, into transportation planning, into health and wellness, into criminal justice reform, all these other sort of industries or fields. And that's that my career has been in that space. Despite the success of this effort, this national, international effort over the last 15 years or so, which has really been focused on building capacity for artists and arts organizations to work cross-sector, right? Work with those civic side or industry side partners, with not as much focus on the building capacity for the industry side partners to embrace arts and culture into what they do. And so that's really the space that we try to fill is we focus on hospitals, health and human service agencies, care providers as our sort of client or target audience, and help them build their capacity to improve outcomes for their patients through the arts.
What is an example of, say, someone who might have just pick one, a struggle mentally and might go through this process all the way to y'all's service?
Sure. So one of the things that I'm really excited about that we are doing is we've got a partnership with Carnegie Hall in New York. They've been running for several years a fantastic program called the Lullaby Project that pairs professional musicians with young mothers, expectant mothers that are coming usually from difficult backgrounds. So here in Atlanta, we've been working with mothers that are that have been in the foster care system. So this is teenage moms, and we pair them up with professional musicians, and they together co-write lullabies for their children. And there's all this wonderful research that shows how going through this process and writing a lullaby, performing the lullaby, recording the lullaby, which eventually actually gets sent up to Carnegie Hall, and there's an album that's produced every year, all sorts of stuff. It's a wonderful thing that they're doing. But research shows that engaging in this activity strengthens the mother-child bond, which not only improves the mother's well-being, but investing in a young mother is also investing in that mother's child.
Sure.
And the young women that go through the program do so together. And so there's a sort of cohort or community that's formed around it. And it's just a great example of how creativity heals the soul,
Yeah, man, that's heartwarming. I'm sure you have other incredible partnerships mainly focused on making life better for the people.
That is what we do. We're right now we're putting a lot of our energy into developing a platform, if you will, not a technology platform, but a network by which physicians, social workers, school counselors prescribe arts experiences for their patients. There's two population groups that we're looking at. One is adolescents that are struggling with depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, self-harm. And then the other are seniors, people who are 65 plus at risk of social isolation. There's a whole bunch of research with both of those groups about how participating in arts and culture addresses anxiety and depression, and then social connectedness. And of course, unsurprisingly, thinking about our generation, our parents are sort of getting up there. Certainly our grandparents, if they're still around, or are much older, and social isolation speeds up age-related cognitive decline. And participating in arts activities slows that process down. And so this program that we're developing, the Art Pharmacy, is really trying to enable physicians and other care providers to prescribe arts experiences for patients that are struggling with these issues. And then we direct those patients, those individuals, to existing cultural experiences around the state.
Yeah, gosh, what an incredible opportunity. It's such a good time for it. There's a great book called Lost Connections. Have you read that?
I have not.
It's by, I think his name is Johann Harari. He's a British writer, and he's written some really good stuff about the war on drugs. I think that was since Lost Connections, but it's about mental illness and depression, namely, and how it's not necessarily that, and I'm not a doctor, I'm not going to proclaim that I know where the biological set point of depression begins and ends, or how many people are just stuck with depression versus how many people are situationally depressed. But his book has quite a lead in. His book outlines the different ways in which our current culture has evolved into this thing that just doesn't yield the types of things we need mentally and emotionally. So like isolation, right? Meaningless work. Those things were not necessarily common among our ancestors that we evolved from. And that reminds me, like, a lot of your work that I've already learned about right here seems to get in the way of a lot of those things that are in our current culture that are causing those depression, anxiety, all those problems.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're interested. I mean, I know that I personally am interested in that sort of systems change level work. Like, yes, we want to and are improving people's lives today, but what we as an organization, what we as a society, need to do is to figure out how to interrupt these larger systems that maybe unintentionally ended up operating the way that they are, that exacerbates isolation, disconnectedness, and mental health, behavioral health issues. That there are not just interventions to treat the symptoms, but there are solutions to get upstream and address these things before they become such severe problems in people's lives or in particular communities.
Like I said, I'm not a doctor. I don't know where the biological set point for all these problems begins and ends, but I've seen it in myself. I've struggled in the past with what I think was probably situational depression, but it's at least a predisposition to it. And now, like you're saying, I can tell when I'm doing something that would lead to it, and to get upstream of that is really important. And in fact, coming to a community like this shared workspace switchyard has been something that, among other things, such as what we're doing right now, has at least maybe moved me off of a path of isolation that could have led to some problems.
It's easy to take for granted these types of third spaces, which is a sort of lingo like switchyards or the coffee shop, where we go either to meet people intentionally or to just work and be alongside other people. I know that for me, as I've you're starting a new business, right? We've been at this for less than 2 years. Started it is just me.
Mhm.
It's not like I've got a big team that, I pick up the phone and meetings with all day, all that sort of stuff, especially early on. And so to be able to come to a place like Switch Yards and be around other people, I think not only is it a benefit to small businesses or to entrepreneurs, but I think it's a benefit, just as you're saying, to our communities.
It certainly is. And so 2 years ago, you started Sewn Arts. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it hasn't been a smooth, perfectly comfortable journey. No entrepreneur's journey is, right? So tell me about like the hardest part of it. I know it's a catchphrase there on this. The title of this podcast is the hard part, but like, where did it get really difficult? 'Cause I'm sure it has.
Yeah, it has been. We started exploring what this would eventually become in the fall of 2019. We were several conversations into very meaningful partnership with Piedmont Health Systems, and then the pandemic hit. And trying to work in the health and wellness industry, launch a business in the spring of 2020 was brutal. And so certainly that was a really difficult part. I think that we are trying to do something with the art pharmacy, this social prescribing concept by which care providers prescribe arts experiences for their patients. That's pretty novel here in the United States. And people view arts and culture as a nice to have, not a must have.
Mm-hmm.
And that is another really big challenge. We view it as a really important ingredient of a whole health approach. It's certainly not the only thing that people need to do, but it's an important way for people to care for themselves. And so finding the language, articulating the research, because there's an abundance of research that shows, there are centers for arts and health or arts and medicine at Harvard and Duke and the World Health Organization, and the list goes on and on. But people still see it as a nice to have, not a must have.
Sure.
And getting over that barrier has been a challenge, and I imagine will continue to be a challenge for years to come. So we've got to be smart on how we address that. Trying to think about other challenges. Do
you have any specific stories in which when you were just starting out, say at the beginning of last year, where you maybe ran into a wall in a conversation or got to a point where you were like, I'm really uncertain as to whether this is going to be sustainable? Was that ever considered?
I imagine most entrepreneurs, until they, really get over that hump, which, for all you listeners out there, is years down the road, when you're over that hump, not months down the road, where you're asking the question, is it sustainable? I was having a conversation with a potential investor in our work, potential funder in our work. And this person is had a very successful career in the real estate industry, is a pretty sort of middle of the road person, but is a big philanthropist. And got a personal connection to this guy, and he'd asked me to kind of come pitch him and share what we were doing, which I did. And he said, Chris, man, this sounds like really fringe idea. And I want to know, I'm eager, like I'm a captive audience. But I think you're going to have a hard time selling this to people that don't already know, that don't already get it. And that was a big kind of aha for me, that my messaging wasn't right.
Uh-huh.
Right. That was when I said, okay, this, this sort of tip of the spear arts and mental health concept, in the way that I'm talking about it isn't the right thing. So what is people want to be a part of movements, right?
Yeah.
Like that's really when people are investing, unless you get to really sophisticated philanthropy, people want to be a part of movements. And so I had to sort of reevaluate how I was talking about it and what movement is it that we're inviting people to be a part of. And it really is about addressing the mental health and social isolation crisis in America.
Yeah.
So that is, was and continues to be a big question of how do we make this sustainable. We've been fortunate to have enough funding for to get through at least a couple of more years. But as we know, with all small businesses, it's always, on a razor's edge.
Sure. Man. So tell me, like after that meeting, guy said things going to be really hard for you. What resources did you come across that were helpful and maybe starting to improve?
Well, it reminded me, and I was thinking about this actually as I listened to the first episode of,
you and
of the podcast.
the 12 other people.
And no, there were more than 12.
15.
There were at least 14.
At least 14.
For sure. That the importance of regularly taking the temperature of trusted advisors. And so I think you asked a question of your last guest, how do you know, that to keep pushing forward? And his answer was, I had to trust myself. And any entrepreneur needs to trust themselves. Like, I believe that is true. But I've really relied on sort of a kitchen cabinet. Yes, we have a board of directors that is intimately involved in the organization, that governs the organization, does all that sort of stuff. But beyond the board, I've got a kitchen cabinet of advisors that I check in with regularly and ask the question, are we still headed down the right path? And I want people in my life that tell me no when the answer is no, right? I don't need somebody to co-sign my bullshit, like, not necessary. That does not lead me down a path where I am prosperous, where I am making a meaningful impact in my community. And so I'm regularly asking people to help me take a temperature on what we're doing. And I think like any small business, right? Take the nonprofit hat off, or the nonprofit lens off, because that's just a tax status. This is a small business. I gotta pay rent. I gotta pay, I gotta make payroll, right? I gotta deliver on the goods and services that we promise people, like every other small business. In the first couple of years of any small business, you're learning what the market wants, right? And so when I wrote a business plan 2 years ago, it said, this is what we're going to do. It's different today. Now, is it 100% different? Is it 75% different? No, but it's 30% different. There's been a lot of new information that I've discovered over that time period that has helped narrow our focus.
So you said you've got your kitchen cabinet, and hopefully none of the people will co-sign your bullshit.
Yeah.
Do you remember a conversation when it was less far along, when the business was less far along, that kind of made a light come on for you?
I do. This is probably right at a year ago. And I was talking to somebody who's been a mentor for me through the years, and giving him an update on what we were doing. And he said, Chris, the way that you're talking about this, I think people are already doing it. But you're telling me nobody else is doing this in the South. And so there's a disconnect there. Either the way that you're framing this work isn't aligned with how you view it, or you're not aware of what else is in the market for this. And so I had to go back and do some thinking about which parts of the suite of services that we provide really are in demand and really are solving a problem versus what is sort of a duplication of what others are already doing. And we don't, I don't want to do that. Like, I'm not interested in starting another nonprofit to do something that somebody else is already doing. Like, it is a resource restricted environment. Mm-hmm. And I don't need to try to reinvent the wheel. Mm-hmm. I want to look at old problems and develop new solutions to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it, you said in the nonprofit world, you didn't want to get in someone else's space. Is that common among nonprofit entrepreneurs that kind of want us to collaborate on different things?
Yeah, I think it's pretty common. A couple of things are common. So everybody thinks they can do something better, right? When they don't have experience doing it. And so, and quite frankly, I was that person at 19 years old when I started my first business. We did very well, but I was completely ignorant at 19 to what else was out there.
Yeah.
And so I think that folks do that sometimes, very well intentioned, like no one gets into the nonprofit space or social impact space because, they're money hungry or power hungry, right? I mean, people want to do good, even if, they don't always know how to do it. And I've been one of those people, right? Like, not every way that I've tried to solve the problems that the businesses I've run are trying to solve has been right. I also think that one of the sort of ahas for me over my career journey is how different competition is in the nonprofit community versus the for-profit community. If you look at commercial real estate as an example, competitors in the commercial real estate industry want their competitors to be successful. There's very much a rising tides mindset, right? Because
in commercial real estate,
yeah. that if a particular corridor is getting new investment and there's half a dozen investors and developers that are coming in and building new apartments or condos or retail, that's good for the development down the street. And so there's competition, right? People want to do better than their competitors, but it's not a zero-sum mindset. But in the nonprofit community, and this of course isn't always true, but can be true. I have had this mindset before, and it's a challenge for me to not have this mindset, and I need to remember to be supportive of the competition, because I do believe that rising tides lifts all ships. But in the nonprofit community, it's such a resource restricted environment. It's viewed as a zero-sum game. And so if Foundation A is giving away $1 million a year, they're only giving away $1 million a year.
Yeah.
And whether they're 5 nonprofits that apply for those grants or 500 nonprofits that apply for those grants. And so folks are so under-resourced and struggle to make ends meet in the nonprofit space that we don't support each other enough. I've been guilty of that and really trying to kind of do it differently this go round.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting trials and tribulations in the nonprofit world. But it makes a lot of sense. There's limited amount of money to go toward charity. I don't want to call it charity because that sounds like an oversimplification, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And, people that are working in the social impact space are trying to solve society's biggest problems, right? Thinking about here in Atlanta, we've got issues around housing affordability. We've got issues around, access to jobs, racial justice and racial inequity issues. I mean, these are issues that are hundreds of years old, and you have a lot of nonprofits, some small, some big, that are trying to solve them with a really limited pool of resources to address them. And so I think a lot of the competition and negative competition comes into play when folks are just feeling the stress and pressure of running their business.
Yeah, which you have to consider, like
Yep.
you said. So do you have an example of when it came to light for you that this is kind of a tough game here, this nonprofit thing? Like, it's not all sunshine and flowers, right? People are competing for dollars.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I grew up in kind of private school, North Atlanta. My household, certainly my parents did well and we wanted for nothing, but relative to a lot of our friends, didn't have gobs and gobs of money. I bought my first car, kind of thing.
Good job.
$3,000, piece of junk.
Is that the Bronco?
That was
I remember the Bronco.
Yep. And bought it from Jonathan Shapley's brother.
All right.
When I started this first organization, I'm 19, 20 years old, and I'm like, man, I know all these really wealthy people. It's going to be easy to go out and raise a few $100,000 a year. And that could not be furthest from the truth. One of my first fundraising meetings, sat down with a guy who I, knew relatively well, asking him for some advice, asking him for support. And he said, Chris, rich people don't get rich by giving their money away. And that was a pretty cold thing to say. And maybe a true thing to say, for some. So I knew from early on that meeting the resource requirements of these challenges that the nonprofit community is trying to serve or trying to address was going to be really difficult. But funders, society at large, still expects us to pay our bills on time, still expects us to keep the lights on, and expects us to address the most intractable problems of society with way less resources, right? And so are we then able, as a sector, able to go out and attract the best and brightest talent to solve these intractable problems with limited resources? Of course, the answer is no. And so I do think that's why it takes multi-sector collaboration, and we have to have the nonprofit sector, the government or public sector, and private sector collaborating to address problems. And anytime lasting, sustainable change happen is when people or businesses from disparate experiences in life, disparate industries, disparate fields come together, find common values, and make change there.
We could really use a lot of that now.
We could, man. We could. It's a tough time in that regard.
Well, I don't want to keep you a whole lot longer. I do want to make sure, I know the sound is working, but I want to double check. So I'm going to stop it here and then ask you a few more questions.
Great.
Just want to make sure.
Sounds great.
Thanks.
This podcast is in its infancy, and with that comes technical difficulties. That conversation didn't all get recorded, which is okay because you saw the best parts, but the end of it included talks between Chris and I about alternative forms of mental health treatment, the phases of mental illness, and the phase or part at which Chris's company plays the most significant role, and a little bit more about both of our journeys. It was a fruitful conversation. I hope you feel that way too. All links to Chris's website, Chris's work, and things mentioned during the podcast will be in the description of the video or the show notes in case you are approaching this in audio version only. Appreciate you stopping by. See you next time.